Okay, we left off here. We've already looked at Indian political systems and political development in the classical period, in the Axial Age, from the Mauryan dynasty to the Gupta dynasty and in between. Though, again, that was a brief overview. Our text doesn't do much more anyway, but in truth, Indian politics was extremely complicated. We're leaving out lots of developments and lots of small states and kingdoms and principalities and so forth. But we move on, and we were at this slide last time. So trade, family life, caste system, and then our main topic of focus in the entire unit, the three big religions that come out of India during the Axial Age. Trade and economic developments, quoting Professors Bentley and Ziegler. During the Mauryan era, merchants continued to use overland routes, but they increasingly turned to the sea to transport their goods. As early as the 5th century BCE, Indian merchants had traveled to the islands of Indonesia and the Southeast Asian mainland, where they exchanged pearls, cotton, black pepper, and Indian manufactured goods for spices and exotic local products. Many of those goods did not remain in India, but instead traveled west through the Arabian Sea to the lands bordering the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. Indian products also found markets in the Mediterranean basin. Indian pepper became so popular there that the Romans established direct commercial relations and built trading settlements in southern India. A large volume of trade between India and the Mediterranean lands was in place during this period. So a couple things I'd like to sort of zero in here and pick out is that Indian cotton, and just the fact that it says here that Indian manufactured goods were often traded, which included cotton, shows us that India's economic development was already advanced, and more advanced than many, if not all, of the kingdoms and places it was trading with. When you've got manufactured goods, this is true today, when you have manufactured goods going out and other things coming back in, not always, the United States actually might be an exception right now, but most of the time it means advantage to the country that's exporting manufacturers and, say, importing resources or foodstuffs. So India's economy does appear to have been quite advanced. Also, the fact that the trade they're doing and products they're bringing back to India don't always stay there, but they get sort of transported to another place, shows us the complexity of their economy and complexity of trade. Another sign of it being a very advanced economy for the time. Although it's not, of course, one economy, since there's a lot of decentralization off and on during this period. Family life in classical India. Some of this we've already touched on in our first look at India not long ago. And this time I'm quoting Bentley and Ziegler again. Most people lived with members of their nuclear family, particularly among higher castes. However, several generations of a family often lived in large compounds ruled by powerful patriarchs. Literary works suggest that women were largely subordinate to men. The two great Indian epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, commonly portrayed women as weak-willed and emotional creatures and exalted wives who devoted themselves to their husbands. In the Ramayana, for example, the beautiful Sita loyally follows her husband Rama into undeserved exile in this famous story, and so it's been used or was used as an example of what was expected of wives to their husbands, a great deal of loyalty. During the early centuries CE, patriarchal dominance became even more pronounced in India. By the Gupta era, which we've talked about, child marriage was common. When girls were age 8 or 9, their parents betrothed them to men in their 20s. Formal marriage took place just after the girls reached puberty. It goes on to say, and I'm breaking up the quote here a little bit, but that wives often came to dominate affairs in their households. So the one place that they tended to have some element of power and authority was in the household, which isn't, of course, uncommon worldwide when we go back to these classical ancient societies. The caste system, we've seen its origins already as well. An interesting quotation here that I'll read and then model for you, explain, translate, so to speak, from William McNeill in A World History. I mentioned him once, maybe twice before in the class. McNeill is one of the leading experts on world history. In fact, maybe the earliest kind of pioneer of the approach to history that we now know as world history. So he's one of the big historians in this field. Three features of Indian thought and feeling were mobilized to sustain the caste principle. Remember, the caste system, kind of like a class system, but based somewhat on profession, what you did, somewhat based on what sort of social group you came from in society, but not exactly the same as class. So three features of Indian thought and feeling mobilized to sustain the caste principle. One of those was the idea of ceremonial purity. Fear of contaminating oneself by contact with a member of a lower, unclean caste, unclean, this is the way it was seen, gave Brahmins, meaning the powerful, the wealthy, and others near the top of the pyramid, strong reasons for limiting their association with low caste persons. Two, the poor and humble had strong reasons for clinging to caste. All but the most miserable and marginal could look down on somebody, a not unimportant psychological feature of the system. I'm not saying that this was, and I don't think he is either, Professor McNeill, that this was deliberately structured into the system, but it did end up, I think, having that effect. And class systems can sometimes have this effect, even if there's no social mobility. As long as you're above somebody on the social ladder and not at the very bottom, you can feel okay about your position because you can always look down on the people that are beneath you. So even though it wasn't deliberate, it had its sort of brilliant psychological features to it from the point of view of someone who doesn't want to see, a revolution starting from below. Three, another factor sustaining the caste principle was theoretical, the doctrine of reincarnation and of Varna. The latter declared that all men were naturally divided into four classes, right? The caste groups that we already mentioned, plus the untouchables below them. Reality never corresponded even remotely to this theory, however. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of different castes in reality in India, but apparent injustices and anomalies disappeared when the doctrine of reincarnation was combined with the doctrine of Varna. A man of unblemished life, born into the lowest caste, could hope for rebirth higher up the ladder. So another brilliant feature for anyone that had a stake in maintaining the status quo and the current stability and law and order in the society was the fact that the caste system, in a sense, preached, hey, stay in line, follow the rules, follow the laws, don't do anything violent. You have a difficult life, difficult situation, but if you just tough it out and be a good person, you'll be reborn, and in the next life, you might become a Brahmin. You'll be rewarded in the next life, not in this one. So again, this wasn't done deliberately. Didn't have a bunch of guys sitting in a smoke-filled room in secret, cooking up this plot to bamboozle and fool the average person. But it worked out that way nonetheless. So the system did have a tendency to reinforce law and order and following the rules, conforming to what was expected. McNeill goes on to say, caste lessened the significance of political and territorial administration. Everyone identified himself first and foremost with his caste, but a caste ordinarily lacks both definite internal administration and distinct territorial boundaries. No kind of ruler could command the undivided loyalty of people who felt themselves to belong to a caste rather than a state. Here we come to the only explanation that I'm going to give you. I mean, I'm not giving it to you. McNeil is, and he's not alone on this, for why, as we've already noticed, that in India it seemed to be more difficult to bring about centralized power, or at least consistency and over the long haul. The most obvious reason, because it stands out as a difference from most other places of the world we're looking at, where centralized rule in most cases does become the norm, does stay consistent over time, not perfectly, but more consistent than here, and that is that in India there's a caste system, which means that loyalty is oftentimes to the caste first, to your particular caste group first, and to rulers and princes and kings and emperors second. So there's definitely a divided loyalty problem here. That's somewhat true in different ways in other parts of the world, but in those we'll see that at least at various times that centralization of power becomes more difficult as well. So looking now last and most importantly at the religions of classical India, we see a chart that compares and contrasts Buddhism and Hinduism, and a look on the left at Jainism and Buddhism together. So there are similarities in all these religions, but there are differences as well. Looking at the differences, you can look at the chart on the left yourself. It doesn't tell us too much, but looking at the similarities, the differences between the two religions that go on to have tremendous impact on the world up until the present. In Buddhism, the sort of main spiritual teacher, of course, was the Buddha, and still is. In Hinduism, it wasn't any one particular person in history. It was gurus, and it could be gurus of the past, gurus of the present as well. So it wasn't sort of one central figure, not like a Jesus or a Buddha-like figure. As far as religious texts were concerned, the Buddha's teachings written down by followers and acolytes. In Hinduism, there's a whole group of them, all of them of incredible importance, many of them brilliant writings. The Vedas and the Upanishads, which we've already seen, they came in an earlier era and laid the groundwork for the Mahabharata, already mentioned in this unit, and the Ramayana. There are others, of course, as well. The afterlife, for the Buddhists, it's nirvana or some form of reincarnation. Get to nirvana. For the Hindus, it's moksha or reincarnation. So both religions have at least some type of belief in transmigration or reincarnation. We'll get to moksha in the slide on Hinduism. Beliefs and practices, the Buddhists, the Eightfold Path becomes crucial, as first laid out by the Buddha himself, Siddhartha Gautama. And for Hinduism, karma, we know, is an important part of the religion. Reincarnation, we already mentioned. The sort of three paths to God, Atman, and again, some of these we'll get into in more. But this is somewhat helpful for you to go back and study. It keeps it pretty simple, probably more simple than the slides that follow, which are, admittedly, I'm warning you now, a bit messy. So Jainism, this didn't become a world spread religion like the other two, but in its time it had an impact, and it does sort of seep in to the other two religions in ways that we'll see as well. So though the Jains don't have the global impact of the other two, they do sort of bleed into them somewhat. The Religion was begun by the now famous Mahavira. The dates you see there, the great hero, born at about 540 BCE. His disciples refer to themselves as the Jains after Mahavira or Jina, the conqueror. So his many disciples basically took their name from him. As far as beliefs were concerned, everything in the universe, according to this religion, has a soul, and the soul must be released from the physical body to end suffering. Even right there, given what you probably already know about Hinduism and or Buddhism, even if it's only a little bit, you can already see there is a connection there. Only purification from selfishness could sort of release souls from their imprisonment. Could souls be released from their imprisonment? So you have to purify and get away from selfishness, or that can't happen. The concept of ahimsa is a commitment to extreme non-violence toward all living things, which shows up, of course, non-violence anyway as a principle, as a prominent part of Hinduism as well, but not taken to the extreme that it was by the Jains. And because of that, it was extremely hard to follow. Though it did tend to appeal to kind of a wide range of people. In its time, this religion did become popular, even though it was hard to follow. We see happen throughout the world, we go back to the ancient period and move forward, is that religions oftentimes have to change and lighten up a bit in order to keep adherents. So if the religion is too hard and too difficult to if what's expected of you to be a true follower of the religion, a true follower of God or the gods, if it's too exacting, people start to drop out, not do it any longer. So the religions, at least some strands of them, some offshoots of them at times, will say, okay, let's make it easier. If you just do this, this, and this, that'll we'll count that. But the Jains weren't as willing to do that as others. As Elizabeth Pollard, who I've quoted before, also says ahimsa, which literally means no hurt, held that every living creature has a soul-killing, even an ant would result in an unfavorable rebirth, meaning you'll come back reincarnated, but you'll move down, not up. You'll come back as something disgusting, not as somebody better. Believers had to watch every step to avoid inadvertently becoming murderers. Can't step on ants, can't step on bugs, etc. It sounds like it would be excruciatingly anxiety-producing if you believed it. The extreme nonviolence of Jainism was impossible for many, though Mahavira's teachings were transmitted orally for nearly a millennium before being compiled into writing by followers in the 5th century CE. So I think maybe it's an interesting religion, to be sure, in its own right, worthy of study just to know. But we can see here, I think, most importantly, this does overlap with and meld into Hinduism, to a lesser extent into Buddhism as well. Which brings us to the rise of the latter, Buddhism itself. I should say this, I tend to assume that everybody already knows this, but I should not. But Buddhism, though it's associated more with other Asian countries like China and Japan, Southeast Asia, its birthplace was India. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, was from a noble Indian family, born in approximately 560 or so BC. He's known for, in his young adulthood and youth, looking around and getting outside of sort of his family's palace for the first time and being shocked at seeing suffering. Because he'd lived such a charmed life as a rich kid, everything taken care of, he hadn't realized that there were people that lived in poverty and that had extremely difficult lives and hard to bear problems, and this apparently shocked him. And so he began a search for enlightenment, a search for an understanding of life and suffering, and if there's anything one could do about it, which led him to meditation. It led him to a real asceticism. Again, asceticism is an ascetic is someone who lives a life not free from all possessions, but free from most possessions, and not concerned with acquiring stuff so much. He famously sat under a tree in Bodh Gaya for 49 straight days, and afterwards he apparently understood suffering and became the Buddha, or the enlightened one. Now, how much of that story is true and how much of it is myth, I'll leave to you. I don't know myself. It's open to interpretation, of course. He left many disciples behind him, yellow-robed monks with begging bowls. So, in some ways, monks in the Buddhist tradition are similar to monks in the Catholic tradition that we'll get to as well. Some of the monastic groups in Europe walk around in their robes with begging bowls, and they live hand to mouth by going door to door. The core Buddhist doctrine is Dharma and the Four Noble Truths. And these are really, really important to understand if you want to make some sense out of Buddhism and its impact on the world, even now, and on individuals, even now. People all over the world, not just in Asian countries, are Buddhists. Plenty of Americans are Buddhists because they like, what it offers. All life is suffering is the first noble truth. Desire is the cause of suffering is the second truth. So when we desire anything, have a strong desire for something, whether it's food or whatever, it brings about suffering because we feel deprived of what we desire and don't have. But then elimination of desire is the third truth, ends suffering. If desire is the cause of suffering, then if we end desire, you end suffering. And the fourth noble truth leads us to 8 things you have to do. A disciplined life following the Eightfold Path is the recommended prescription for eliminating suffering. So what's the Eightfold Path? Leading overall in general a balanced life, not luxury, not even asceticism, sort of somewhere in between. You don't have to be as ascetic and sort of saintly as the Buddha and other famous religious figures, but you're supposed to kind of cut it down the middle. And this will eventually lead to a certain amount of detachment from the world and lessen desire. And by detachment from the world, it doesn't mean you can't take part in the world. It doesn't mean you should not take part in the world. It means you should be able to take part in it as anybody else does, and enjoy life or have a fulfilling life, but don't get too caught up in it. Be able to sort of see things and come from a detached perspective, kind of like seeing from outside of yourself back in, and don't get too bogged down by all of the pressures, anxieties, and even joys of life, which can, of course, lead to desire as well. You can desire when you're deprived of something, of food, but you can have desire, and people usually do, even when they have riches and wealth and fame and fortune and success. It doesn't eliminate desire, sometimes just different and new desires. But so that's generally speaking what the Eightfold Path is trying to bring about, the balanced life, to at least start down the path of relieving or lessening anxiety. But the Eightfold path itself: right belief, right resolve, right speech, behavior, occupation, effort, contemplation, and meditation. So meditation certainly is well known as part of this, but so there's a path laid out, 8 sort of parts that is designed to eliminate or greatly reduce suffering. And for those who get there, which would probably be few, even if you just ask people, and even from there, some may have been or are lying, or they think they've reached nirvana and they haven't. If there is such a thing, and I'm an agnostic on all these religions we're studying in this class, every one of them, at least for the purposes of teaching the class. That will be true when we get to Judaism and Christianity and Islam as well. But this nirvana becomes a state of perfect spiritual independence, where you've sort of been removed from the great cares and worries and really kind of emotions of life, both positive and negative, that do cause suffering because they stem from desire. So when you've eliminated desire, eliminated suffering, basically reach nirvana. As Stephen Prothero, in the lower right of the screen, says in God is Not One, tremendous, fairly recent book on the world's religions, at least its major ones. The title itself shows that Prothero, different than I think most scholars on religion, at least scholars that are writing about, talking about how religions relate to each other, his take is that his focus is on the differences between this religion and that. When authors, experts on religion, scholars, when they write about the world's religions, they tend to try to find what they have in common and what their common denominator is. He thinks that's a misguided approach, and he focuses on what's different about each one. And he has kind of a simple formula, not that the book is this simple, but for each of the major religions, he sort of says there's a problem, or at least something that has to be dealt with, a solution, a goal, a technique for achieving that goal, and there are exemplars or guides to achieving the goal. So in Buddhism's case, just to simplify here, the problem is suffering. Human beings suffer, and this causes, of course, all kinds of problems. The solution or the goal is to achieve nirvana, which is more or less relief from suffering. The technique, the way to get from suffering to nirvana, is the eightfold path to lessen and then eliminate suffering. And the exemplars or guides are the bodhisattvas, who are kind of like spiritual guides, spiritual experts, and usually those that have sort of gone down the path themselves. So it's a remarkably interesting religion to study. I have read a number of books on it over the years, and it's quite different from the monotheistic religions of the West in many ways, as you can probably already see. And there's a lot of, I think, positive features to this. The Asian religions that we're looking at now, at this time, in many ways, to me, and it's my own opinion, appear to be ahead of what other peoples are doing in other parts of the world. At least big chunks of sort of their religious belief and practice. On the other side, however, again, trying to play devil's advocate here, I would say that, and this, I'm not the first person, of course, to argue this by any means, but that Buddhism, in a sense, can be seen to be telling people, counseling them to, away from the idea, and I'm really simplifying here, using a cliche, but they're advising them away from the kind of no pain, no gain philosophy. Without suffering, without at least a certain amount of it, how are you motivated to sort of lead a better life, to improve, to achieve goals, etc. Maybe the Buddhist says you don't need to achieve goals, but there does seem to be something there that is open to criticism. I mean, there are other things that people have criticized besides that, but just to give you a sort of a sense of pros and cons in looking at the Buddhist tradition then and now. Lastly, the rise of Hinduism, which people I think do know that it originated in India. Unlike what they think about Buddhism, I don't know where people assume it came from, but I think if you quizzed most people, or stopped them on the streets randomly and told them, that most people I don't think would get that Buddhism originated from India as well. We've already, in the previous unit on early India, looked at the Vedas and Upanishads as extremely important religious documents and texts, beautifully written and classics of ancient literature, as well as religious ideas. But now, and these are still being used, so this is still kind of these are still the foundational texts for what become Hinduism. But they're moving away from kind of the Brahmin tradition now, which relied on priests. And from this point forward, there's going to be less reliance on those kind of authority figures. The new by the time we're talking about here, texts stemming from the earlier ones, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, already mentioned, have a number of gods and stories. We've already briefly talked about Rama and Sita, the ideal couple. Vishnu, one of the crucial gods, preserver of the world. A sort of subsection of one of these classics of the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, Song of the Lord. And this is one of the most important and oft cited parts of these great religious texts. There's also a short episode in the Mahabharata, another famous story between a conversation between the warrior Arjuna and his charioteer, guy basically driving his chariot, Krishna, who's actually, unbeknownst to Arjuna, the god Vishnu. And among other things, moral lesson being, there are a number of lessons being taught to Arjuna here, and to, of course, readers and practitioners of Hinduism, that there's sort of a moral duty of a warrior. Arjuna doesn't want to go into battle and risk his life and this and that, and that's what the conversation is basically about. There are other moral lessons in there as well, but one of them that's being preached is that sometimes, depending on your station in life and who you are, what's expected of you, you have to sort of do what's morally expected. So a lot of lessons come out of these great literary as well as religious classics. The soul doesn't die, samsara, doctrine of reincarnation, which I've already mentioned. You probably do know that that's a part of Hindu religion and belief, that the soul doesn't die and you come back in a different form, sometimes referred to as transmigration, in another life or other lives. And you either sort of have a better life, you can come back as an animal and get demoted if you don't do well in this life. If you do well, you can come back as a person with more power and an easier life, a better life, happier life, etc. The caste system places certain duties on you that Hinduism backs up, rewards and punishments. There's a belief that faith, that sticking to the faith and its traditions, its beliefs, will bring salvation. So here's one element that has something in common even with the Western religions. Overall Hindu ethics, one doesn't have to renounce life. So the Hindus, for instance, don't say that you're not supposed to have fun and not supposed to enjoy, sex. It's not true. They are saying moderation, which is true of lots of religions, with regard to how to live in this world in preparation for another world. But also that sort of things should be gradually kind of moving to a more refined state of the soul as you go through life. So if you live up to expectations in this life, you achieve salvation, but it doesn't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be perfect, especially right away. You sort of learn as you go. But action that you take in life should be done out of faith and duty, without concerns for rewards or punishments, or I should say rewards or other types of gain, particularly material, monetary. Specifically, there's supposed to be an adherence to moral law, dharma. Pursuit of economic well-being is in there. That's in the religion. Artha, enjoyment of social, physical, sexual pleasure, kama. You may have heard of the Kama Sutra. So there's a whole book of coming from the Hindu religion that's about it's a handbook about sexual pleasure. So it's not a prudish religion in any way, and I think that's often mischaracterized or misunderstood by those who haven't delved into the religion or read much about it. And salvation of the soul, moksha. So that's sort of the ultimate goal is salvation. And once you've achieved that, then in most or all cases, you don't have to keep going through sort of the transmigration process. Once you sort of come back, and each time you live a different life, a different person, it's a different thing. But each time, if you improve and basically get to the end, it's like you've graduated, and now you are now you have achieved salvation. Hinduism did have wide appeal. It was practical. Most people couldn't live up to the old religious requirements. So if you go back to the traditions coming out of the Vedas and Upanishads, which again were the origins of this new and great religion, Hinduism, but it was too exacting, especially with Brahmins or priests expecting, in the sense they expected people living everyday lives, not holy men, not priests, not ministers, not rabbis, to sort of adhere to the religious principles and expectations as astutely, as fervently as priests and Brahmins and others. So that was clearly unrealistic. So around this time, and certainly after the classical period, we see the Hindu religion start to not expect as much out of average people, and for good reason, because they would have lost too many for the religion to have had an ongoing historical and large-scale influence. Thank you.